I watched the defense closing argument in the Stacy Rodriguez trial, so you didn't have to. You can thank me later. At the end, I wondered if she wanted some cheese with all that wine. Hi, folks. Tony DeWitt again with another video on the law. Remember, I don't dispense legal advice here, and this is what we're talking about today. Today, we're going to talk about storytelling. The story is sort of the universal framework for communicating information. While I could go into a long and involved narrative about why you shouldn't lie and why it's harmful to you, and it will come back to bite you, it's a lot easier just to tell you the story about the boy who cried wolf, something we all learn early on. Bruno Bettelheim's book, The Uses of Enchantment, The Meaning and Importance of Fairy Tales, explores the psychological significance of fairy tales in children's development. It was published in '76, and the book analyzes how these stories play a critical role in helping kids navigate complex emotions and situations. He argues that fairy tales contribute to a children's emotional and psychological development by addressing universal human problems and conflicts. These stories help children deal with anxieties and fears in a symbolic manner. And he believes that fairy tales are important because they impart moral lessons. They allow children to explore the consequences of bad actions and bad decisions within a safe and imaginative framework, helping them understand the right from the wrong. It is for this reason that the uses of enchantment, the uses of story format, that's why plaintiffs' attorneys and prosecutors use the story framework for communicating facts in a compelling and persuasive manner. Every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Watch how the prosecutor in the Rodriguez case closes in story format by telling the tale of the crime.
I want to start off by refocusing our attention in this case, because this case is a trial about Christopher Dickerson. You didn't hear much about him because it kind of devolved into this sideshow toxic relationship between the defendant and Miss Varela. But it's not about that. We need to bring him back into this because Christopher Dickerson's life ended tragically, violently, and intentionally at the hands of this defendant, Stacy Rodriguez, in the early morning hours of October 3rd, 2021. It's about her murdering Christopher in his own home, stealing his property, returning to the house to burn it down, in the process destroying the evidence.
In just a few sentences, the prosecutor lays out the story. He then gets into the law in order to set the stage for, as Paul Harvey would say, the rest of the story, or perhaps more appropriately, the middle of the story.
But in the defendant's own words, with that in mind, remember, she admitted to the act of killing Christopher Dickerson. She admitted having the mental state of with intent and intentionally of killing Christopher Dickerson. But she qualified that. She qualified that because it was in self-defense. But remember, self-defense is a conscious action, kind of a confession and avoidance. I did it, but, right? Now, you sat here for the last couple of weeks. You heard a lot of individuals. You heard a lot of testimony. You saw a significant number of exhibits, right? But who didn't you hear from? You didn't hear from Christopher Dickerson. You didn't hear from Christopher Dickerson because the defendant murdered him. Now, it's easy to sit there and attribute statements to somebody that can't come in and defend themselves. In other words, you can say anything you want. You can admit what you can't deny what you can't admit. But actually, in a roundabout way, you actually did hear from Mr. Dickerson. You heard that on that weekend of October 1st through October 3rd, he was happy. He had some friends visit him from out of state. Job prospects looked good. He had a house. He had his animals. He had finances. He had things saved up. Life looked pretty good until he met this defendant, Miss Varela. You saw him interact in the late evening hours of October 2nd and the early morning hours of October 3rd. You saw him leave his house. You saw him go downtown to Greeley. You saw his interactions in various establishments. You were able to track his movements as he went through there. You were able to see the point where the convergence happened, where he fatefully met this defendant. Goes back to his house. You saw that with the defendant, Miss Farella. You know he met a friend, Dolores, downtown. He leaves his house to go pick her up, take care of that. He comes back to the house with the defendant, Miss Farella. You note that watching the house, you can see that from the video surveillance. You know they're inside. They come out at some point for a smoke break. You get to watch him. He's telling you what they were doing, right? At some point, though, you see one person leave, Miss Farella, get in the Chevy Malibu. And then minutes later, you see another individual, the defendant, come walking out. We know through the course of the investigation that Christopher's telling you he's dead now. He was killed and murdered by the defendant. You know through the course of the investigation that no 911 was used at that time, no reporting to authorities. You know that these two individuals, the defendant, Ms. Farella, left, traveled a little bit, came back to the house. How do you know that? Because Christopher's cell phone is telling you that. You know he's dead. His cell phone came out of the house. 3 went in, 2 come out. They come back to the house, still no call to law enforcement or authorities, still no reporting this. Ms. Farella stays in the car. The defendant walks back up there, enters the house, in there for a few minutes, and then you see the bright glow in Christopher's house. You know she set the fire.
He's telling a story chronologically, and it provides a damning look at the defendant's actions. He goes on for about 40 minutes, and he ends with this.
We heard this testimony about social anxiety and, I, for lack of a better term, an emotional support battery. That makes no sense. She talks about going to the bars, hanging out with people, doesn't know what a dartboard is, but they're always looking for an after party, either a known or unknown homes. Social anxiety, that's the excuse. But she had a battery in her hand, so that must have helped. But ultimately, when advised by Detective Burrows what she's being charged with, there was no hesitation. Really? Do you have proof of that? Yes. Yes. Yes, we have proof of that. You heard it. You saw it. This isn't self-defense. This wasn't done in a hasty and impulsive manner. Ladies and gentlemen, this was intentional. This defendant is guilty, and we ask you to return verdicts of the same.
It had a beginning and a middle and an end, and using Christopher, the victim, to tell the story was effective, I think. It was clear, relatively concise, and it laid out the facts well. He had an opportunity to argue the law in there as well, but the law was less important, I think, at this point than the story, because the jury is the judge of the facts, and the facts come from the story. What I do want to illustrate is that he argued in a persuasive manner using this framework, and that's important. Good plaintiff's attorneys, good prosecutors do that. Now, the defendant in this case used the story format too, but they did it during Stacey Rodriguez's direct examination. Several times in closing, the prosecutor referred to it as scripted, and it certainly was. That's what a defense attorney does. He sits down and he says, "We're going to put you on the stand. These are the questions we're going to ask you. I'm going to ask you this, you're going to say that. I'm going to ask you this, you're going to say that." Because they already know the story. They have to figure out a way to tell it in the most compelling way. So, yeah, it's scripted. There's nothing wrong with that, although certainly the prosecutor tried to imply that there was. Now, there's a great book called Save the Cat, and it's about stories. Here's Save the Cat writes a novel. I wish I'd read it before I wrote my novels. They would certainly have been better. In case you're wondering, one of the themes of the book is not to make characters too one-dimensional, too molded out of plastic. In other words, on the way to going to kill a good guy, the nasty assassin saves a cat from being run over. You cloak your characters in a full 3 dimensions. You don't make them one-sided. Of course, it's about fiction, so it's a natural fit for defense attorneys. Sorry, I couldn't help it. But the defense must have read it because they painted her as being upset after the kill. She had to go and lie down. She was so upset over the trauma she had suffered. Just for the record, I believe 5 stab wounds in the neck is probably a great deal more trauma than she suffered. So there's that. So much for story theory. On to the defense closing. I'm going to keep it brief so as not to annoy you. The defense has nothing to prove in most cases, but in self defense cases, they have to prove the elements of self defense. They tried to do that through the defendant's testimony. I don't think it hit home. But now, in closing, what we get is a bunch of whining nitpicking that goes on almost forever. She starts by attacking the chief witness against the defendant, her former lover, Hosanna Varela. I have to mute a little bit of this because it's simply too graphic, but if you watch the stream, you'll hear the words.
Before you got to meet Stacy, you were painted a picture of a predator in every sense of the word. In their opening, they called her a vicious and violent murderer. A person who randomly decides to kill a stranger while driving in a car where there was nothing but, quote, good vibes. Who stabs a man 5 times and then looks, quote, glowing, quote, refreshed, and, quote, excited before going back and getting more and stabbing him more. A person who is so deranged that after stabbing a domestic violence batterer who hit their partner with a car 3 different times, held a knife to her throat, beat her, caused cuts all over her body, and who threatened her children's lives.
I'm not sure what she thought she was doing here to help her case. She just refreshed for the jury all of the horrible imagery put on by the state with the goal of picking nits about that later on. You know, I think you could have picked the nits without going through all of that. But, you know, she should do her. Maybe she thinks that's effective. Then she recounts the defendant's self serving testimony. I've often said that a question is an effective rhetorical device. But listen to this one and tell me if you think it's an effective rhetorical device.
But you got to hear her. You got to hear from her. You got to see her. When Stacy described to you going to Hosanna's grandmother's house later in the morning of October 3rd, she described getting sick again. But this as a physical reaction to the trauma she had just lived through. She described going into her spare bedroom and not being able to sleep, just laying there, thinking about the nightmare that had just unfolded. And when asked, did you have any other kind of physical reaction that night to what happened? She said, no. I just wanted to be with my mom. I just wanted to be with my mom. Does that sound like a person to you who forms the intent and desire to take a stranger's life in the backseat of a car?
This whiny woman went on and on and on for what seemed like forever. She went for an hour and 26 minutes, and she ended with this.
This is not first-degree murder. It's not second-degree murder. It's just not. Again, let us take things as we find them. Let's not distort. Please find her not guilty of first-degree murder and burglary for the items from Mr. Dickerson's house. Thank you.
That's about as low energy an ending as you can imagine. And the jury probably needed a big cup of coffee after that mendacity atrocity. If you go back and watch the stream and look at the chat, you'll see people saying things like, is this woman ever going to shut up? Let me illustrate what's going on. We all know the story of Goldilocks, right? Once upon a time, there were three bears. They lived in a house of their own in a wood. One of them was a little wee bear, and there was a middle sized bear and a great big bear, and each had a bowl for their porridge, a little bowl for the little bear, a middle sized bowl for the middle sized bear, and a great bowl for the great big bear. They all had a chair to sit in, one that's small, one that's middle, one that's large, yada, yada, yada. You get the idea. Now, remember the way the defense objected to everything? And imagine substituting that voice, that whiny woman voice, for my voice as you listen to this. The prosecution told you that once upon a time there were three bears, but did he name them? No. He couldn't even tell you when it happened. He just said once upon a time. He told you that they lived together in a house of their own in a wood. Bears do not have opposable thumbs. They can't use a hammer or saw wood. How did they build a house? Did they get a contract for the house? Did they show you a contract? They said one of them was a little wee bear, one was a middle sized bear, and the other was a great big bear. Appalling! That's fat shaming. They should be ashamed of themselves. And the rest of it doesn't make any sense either. Bears don't even like porridge. Wouldn't you think, holy cow, you just missed the entire point of that message, didn't you? Well, that's pretty much a summary of the closing here for the defense. They picked nits on the prosecutor's case, but I suspect they either forgot or certainly didn't want to emphasize this testimony.
Ultimately, in the end, and we'll talk in more detail, you would agree that no one stabbed Mr. Dickerson other than you,
Yes.
right? I mean, Hosanna didn't,
No, I said that.
okay? And you would agree that when his phone's going all these places after the fact, he's not alive, right?
No.
Okay? And he didn't tell you in his last dying breaths, hey, take this ring, take this phone, right? He never gave that to you.
The rebuttal closing was again as masterful as the cross examination, and I strongly suspect we'll get a verdict today. So that's what I have for you. Thanks for being here. Come on back and catch me down here tomorrow. Thanks for watching my video. If you have a request for me to cover a topic, please send me an email to the address above, and in the subject line put video request. If you have comments, drop them in the comments down below. If you found the content worthy, please consider subscribing. Since I started doing this work, I have always asked listeners to consider doing just one kind thing every day to make somebody else smile or make their life better in some way. Please consider doing that. It makes the world a better place. Now, YouTube has some suggestions for other videos of mine you may find interesting.